At this point, we're all aware of how we can declare functions in JavaScript and how we can use a function expression. We're using an anonymous function. So let's say that I would declare a function. I would need a function keyword. Then I would need a name for the function. And then in the function body, I would need to write the code that I would want to execute. So since here I would just want to execute a console hello log, if I'm going to uncomment the say hi, and we're going to save it, obviously in the console we're going to have a hello. Now after that, we can look at how we can use a function expression where we use the anonymous function instead. So we have a variable. Now the variable is assigned to a function. However, in our case, the function does not have the name. And again, it takes one parameter. And then in the console log, we have a hello and then the parameter that we're passing in. So again, if we're going to uncomment the hello Bob, we're going to have a hello Bob in the console. Now within the ES6, we have arrow functions or fat arrow functions. Now, what are the key features for the arrow functions? Well, they don't have the name, so they're always going to be anonymous, but they will going to have to be assigned to a variable as a function expression. Then they don't use the function keyword. And then there's different ways how we can use a parameters and work with a return statement. There is also lexical scoping of this, but we're going to look at it in the next video. So for now, let's focus on the parameters and return statement. So how we would write the anonymous function when we have a 0 parameter and return statement is only one line. So if we have these first two with a say hi and say hello, let's have a look at how we're going to do this using the arrow function. So let's write over here 0 parameters, and then once we have the comment, now let's look at what would be the syntax. Well, first of all, we would want to have a function, and we're just going to say that this would be assigned to a variable since the arrow function is going to be anonymous. So let's create a, again, variable of hello, but in our case, let me maybe uncomment this or comment this out so we don't have the same variable name, and this is going to be equal to a arrow function. Now, like I said, with a parameters, if we have 0 parameters, so if we're not passing any parameters, the only thing over here we need to do with a arrow function would be parentheses. Then we're going to have to use the equal sign, and then over here this would be the greater sign. So now we're creating the arrow function or fat arrow function. And also, if the return statement is only one line, we can omit the curly braces, and also we can omit the return statement. So in our case, we can just write log, and let's say over here hello. And if we're going to go back and let's say call this function, so let's say hello, and let's see what we have in a console. So once I save it, I have the hello, and we have our arrow function working. Now, as you can see, this is more concise way of working, and it creates a simple code, and it's easier to look at the code because you don't have a unnecessary function keyword, then let's say another return statement. So we're already starting to see the great features of the arrow functions. Again, let me comment out the invocation so I can always see my console empty. Now let's look at what we would do if we would have one parameter. So let's again create a variable since we're going to have to use a function expression. So let double. Now in our case, this is going to be the one parameter. So as we're passing the one parameter, we would need to write a parameter name, and then we can choose whether we would want to use a parentheses or we can just avoid the parentheses. So with one parameter, we can just omit the parentheses, and then again, we're going to use the fat arrow function sign. And then, like I said before, since this is going to be one line return statement, we don't need to use the curly braces and we don't need to use the return statement. So in our case, we have the double. Now we're going to assign the number to a double. So we're going to call this double, and we're going to pass the number of, let's say, 4. And if everything is correctly, we're going to have 4 multiplied by 2, which would be 8. So if we're going to console log the num and check it out, sure enough, we have the 8. So with a one parameter and one line return statement, this is how the arrow function syntax would look like. Now let's look at a 2 parameters. So 2 parameters, And also let's look at what if the return statement is more than one line. So and more than one line. Now here we're going to create again a variable. So we're going to let multiply. Now we're going to set this variable equal to a arrow function. So over here we're going to write two parameters. First is going to be num1 and the second one is going to be num2. Now if you have more than one parameter, in this case 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, you always need to use the parentheses. So in this case we don't have an option like we had before, or we could use the parentheses or not use the parentheses. In this case we need to use the parentheses. And again we're going to use a fat arrow function, and then since I'm having a return statement as more than one line, I would need to use a curly braces. So in our case let's do const. We're going to set this result, and this is going to be equal to num1 multiplied by num2, and then let's do a return. So now we're having a return, and we're going to call this a result. So once we have set up the fat arrow function, now let's assign it to a variable. So let's sum, and in our case the name would be multiply, and here we're going to pass two parameters, 4 and 4, and if everything works correctly we should be having a 16. So again let's do a log, and let's console log the sum, and sure enough we have the 16. So this is how we would work with a two parameters, and if the return statement is more than one line. So now let's check it out what happens if we're returning the object, because obviously there should be some kind of different way, because the object itself we're going to have a curly braces. So now let's have a look at it. So we're going to have a const object, so this would be the name of the variable, and the object is going to be equal to a arrow function, and in this case we're not going to pass any parameters, so we can use a parentheses. Then again we're going to have a arrow function, and if we're returning the object we need to use another set of parentheses to let the JavaScript know that we're returning the object. So in our case we're going to have name, and we're going to set this equal to a Bob, and over here let's do an age, and the age is going to be, let's say 25 over here. So now we have the variable set up. So let's do a const person. So I'm going to assign this function right now to a object, or I'm sorry, to a person variable, and let's have a look at what we have as a person. So if everything is correctly, this should be name and Bob. So this is how we would work if we're returning the object. Now let's look at two more things. First is going to be how we are working with a filter or any array method that would require a callback function. And then we're going to look at how we can do the same thing as we're working with an event listener. And I'm showing both of the things because both of them are going to require a callback function. Now, with the callback functions, we remember that we have two options. We can use the named function as a callback function or an anonymous function. So this is a great feature where we can use the arrow function. So let's start by saying that there's going to be a const big, so the variable big with a const keyword, and this is going to be equal to a numbers. However, before we do that, let me create an actual array. So const numbers, and this is just going to hold some numbers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And let's say that I would want to return the numbers that are only bigger than 2. Now I can do this using the filter method that I have on array. So we're going to have numbers, so we're selecting array. Then we're going to use the filter method, and for the filter method we have a callback function. Now within the callback function we write what we would want to do with each and every element in the array that we are looping through. So in our case this is just going to be one parameter. This is going to be number, so this is going to reference each and every iteration in the array. And then I would want to say that I would want to return, so I'm just going to call the arrow function. As you notice, I don't need to write a function keyword or set the parentheses, and here I'm just going to say I'm going to return number and bigger than 2. So this is how easy it is to work with an arrow functions. And if we're going to look at a console log, in our case big, we're going to have 3, 4, 5, 6. So as you can see, we don't need to go down in document and actually declare this function. We can just write an anonymous function, and this is a much quicker way of doing that. And the last thing, let's look at how we can attach the add event listener, because if we remember that for the add event listener method, we also needed to use a callback function. So let's say I would want to attach the click event to this button of click me. So let's do a document. Then we're going to have it as a document get element by ID. And here let's look at a button, because this would be the ID that is for the button. And then let's have it as a add event listener. Now for the listening event, we're going to use a click event. So we're going to be listening for a click event. And here we're going to write a callback function. Now again, since we're not using array parameters, we can just write a set of parentheses. Then again, we're going to have to write a fat arrow function. And then let's write what we would want it as a return. So here we're just going to write log. So I'm just going to console log, you clicked me. You clicked me. And obviously we can write more complex code blocks than just console log. But in our case, we just want to see how it works. So let me just console log it and let's see what happens. So if everything is correct, and if the arrow function works as a callback function with our add event listener, then once I click it, you have a you clicked. And over here, let's write you clicked me. And now I can save it. And again, let's press it. And if everything is working still, then we're going to have you clicked me. So now you can see how we can work with arrow functions and how we simplify the code that we're writing with an ES6.